Hey guys, we're going to make this a relatively short video. We're going to cover Articles 4, 5, and 6 and 7 in the Constitution, which are actually much shorter than what you might think. A couple classes got a little bit ahead of the others yesterday, so no worries in that regard. Um, let's talk about Article 4 in the Constitution, which is all about trying to equalize the states and make sure they treat one another as independent states, even though they're under a national government. We mentioned the full faith and credit clause. Okay, that requires that states honor the legal documents and legal recordings from one state to the next. Okay, and a good example of that would be marriage licenses. If your parents got married in another state, say Kentucky, and then they moved here to West Virginia, are they still married even though their marriage license was a certificate, a court document authorized by another state? And the answer is yes. The full faith and credit clause says you've got to honor that legal document from another state. Okay, the same thing would be true with birth certificates. Now, these right here, there's a lot of argument about the full faith and credit clause and what it should and should not recognize. Okay, and remember, we're looking at court documents and court records mainly, not things like, for example, something that would not have to be recognized would be teachers' licenses, for example. Okay, or a like a gun permit, right? Laws governing those, like licensures, that essentially is something that states are not obligated under the full faith and credit clause to honor. Now, what they can do, individual states, if they want to, they can work out an agreement. Like, for example, West Virginia's worked out agreements about reciprocal teachers' licenses. So, like, if I wanted to move to Mississippi, they would immediately give me a Mississippi teacher license because I have a West Virginia one. But that's something that the full faith and credit clause doesn't cover. Only like court documents and court records. So, like lawsuits, court documents like a marriage license, and things like a birth certificate, legal documents. Now, with that in mind, we'll mention this briefly because we're going to hit it harder in the next chapter. The full faith and credit clause is something most people don't pay attention to until a controversy comes up. And in the 1990s, the issue of same-sex marriage made the full faith and credit clause become more of an issue because when states like, and there were just one or two states in the 90s that did this, but when they issued a marriage license to two men or two women, the big question was, would states like West Virginia, the really conservative states, would they have to recognize that? And they had to come up with a whole law from the federal government to try to deal with that. And we'll talk about that. It's called the Defense of Marriage Act next chapter, and boy, it caused some problems. Okay. Article 4 also has the extradition clause in it that criminals who commit crimes in one state but try to flee to another state have to be shipped back. That's called extradition. When you extradite a criminal, you're sending them back to the state where they committed a crime, and they have to do that. So you can't commit a crime in West Virginia and then run over to Ohio and expect them not to ship you back. They will extradite you back to the crime in which, or excuse me, back to the area of the state in which you committed the crime. Somebody asked yesterday, it was a good question, what happens if they commit crimes in multiple states? And usually the answer is they'll send them to the state where the crimes are most severe. So, like if you murdered somebody in West Virginia and then you went and robbed a bank in Texas and then you fled to Colorado, they'd ship you back to West Virginia because that's the more serious crime. All right. Third thing in Article 4 is the Privileges and Immunities Clause. All right. And it says whatever a state does for its own citizens, whatever privileges or immunities they give their own citizens, they have to give those to citizens of other states too. It's kind of like saying you can't be discriminatory against citizens of other states. So, for example, if West Virginia was looking to hire some people for various state jobs, they essentially could not discriminate against somebody because they're from out of state. Or if a West Virginia police officer or a court was considering a fine or a jail sentence for someone, they couldn't treat them differently just because they're out of state. Now, yesterday we brought this up in one class, and it's relevant. People say, well, what about college tuition? You get charged out-of-state tuition if you're not a resident there. And the answer to that is an exception because West Virginia taxpayers spend money, their tax dollars go towards Marshall and WVU and other state schools. Whereas, like somebody from Ohio, their tax dollars do not pay for that. So we're justified in giving people a different tuition in that regard. All right, that's Article 4. Okay, let's go into Article 5 now. And Article 5 is all about how you amend the Constitution. All right, the Constitution is not a static document, it can change. All right, it's not an easy process, and you'll see that here. All right, the amendment process is a two-step process. Okay, if you want to amend the Constitution, you have to first put a proposal out there. It's a lot like marriage, all right? You got to throw a proposal out there first, all right? So here's how it works. For something to be an official proposal for a constitutional amendment, you need two-thirds of both houses of Congress to agree that yes, this should be an official proposal. We think the Constitution should be amended to add this, right? And every year somebody tries to get different things amended into the Constitution. For example, there are amendments about defining marriage. There are amendments about banning abortion. There's been what's called the Equal Rights Amendment for women to try to guarantee equality. All right. And you have to get these just proposed. And it doesn't mean it's officially part of it, but just to make it an official proposal, you need two-thirds of the House and then you need two-thirds of the Senate just to put the proposal out there. So think in my mind, do I want to ask this person to marry me? And two-thirds of both hemispheres of your brain have to agree it's a good idea to pop the big question. All right. Now, once a constitutional amendment is proposed, once it's an official proposal and both houses of Congress have two-thirds of people on board, then you have to go through the difficult process of getting the states involved. All right. Approving a constitutional amendment means getting three-fourths of state legislatures to agree that this should be officially in the Constitution. All right, and that's a difficult process. You need to meet that threshold. You need 38 out of the 50 states to agree that yes, this should go in the Constitution, and that's really hard. Now, when they amend the Constitution, in the past they didn't used to do this, but once an amendment proposal is out there, usually they give states like a time limit. They're like, hey, we need to have the three-fourths of states on board within 5 years or 7 years because states a lot of times take a long time in figuring out what they want to do. So ultimately, they think about whether or not they want to accept that marriage proposal, so to speak. All right. Now, the amendment process, even though the Constitution can change, you should see this, that if you got to get two-thirds of both houses just to get an amendment proposal out there, and then you got to have three-fourths of the states ratify or approve it, that's a pretty difficult process, right? And it doesn't happen very often. For instance, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution get approved right away. All right. And after that, we've only had 17 additional amendments over the last 200 some years. So there's only been 27 amendments, and 10 of them came right away. We have not had a constitutional amendment since 1992. And then before that, you got to go back to 1972. So the Constitution, even though it can change, it's really slow to change. All right. So Article 4 was all about equalizing the states and try to make sure they treat each other and their documents the same. Article 5 is how do we amend the Constitution? Now notice this too. The amendment process is pretty neat because it involves the national government and state governments. All right, because you got to have two-thirds of both houses of Congress to approve a proposal for an amendment. And then to ratify that amendment, you have to have three-fourths of the states. So you're getting the national government and state governments on board with a constitutional amendment. All right, and notice this too. The president is not involved in the amendment process. All right, so Article 5, all about how we amend the Constitution. Let's go to Article 6. It talks about the authority of the Constitution. One of the most important things in the Constitution is what we call the Supremacy Clause. All right, and the Supremacy Clause says that the Constitution and any laws made under the Constitution are the supreme law of the land. Okay? The Constitution and any laws made under the Constitution are the supreme law of the land. That means that if there's any discrepancy between the national government and state governments, it's the national government that's going to be more important. All right? I'll say it again, the Supremacy Clause, it says that, look, the Constitution and any laws made under the Constitution are the supreme law of the land. So, for instance, if the United States Constitution says that we're going to do X and state governments say we're going to do Y, then the Constitution, the federal Constitution, the national government, their Constitution is supreme. It's the supreme law of the land, meaning it's higher than everything else. And this is something else that Anti-Federalists had a strong objection to. They were like, hey, what's the point in having a state constitution or state laws if the national government can just overrule it or supersede it anytime it darn well pleases? All right. But they're like, hey, you have to have some things, like the national government has to be first in certain affairs. And they also pointed out that the national government would be limited in its powers because Article 1 spells out what Congress can do, Article 2 and 3 spell out what the executive and the judicial branch can do. And they're like, hey, just if there's any conflict, the Constitution and any laws made under the Constitution are the supreme law of the land. Okay. Next thing in Article 6, no religious test can be required for a national office. Okay, and it seems like no religious test or no religious oath can be required. Now, remember, we looked briefly at the Massachusetts state constitution, and remember, in there, to be in the legislature there or to be the governor, you had to swear that you were a Christian. And that was not an unusual requirement by states at the time. And if you're thinking that, Article 6 talks about no religion at all, that's not what it's referring to. All right, remember, every state of the original 13 had no problem telling you what they think you should believe. Okay, but because everybody had a different Christian denomination, like you had the Quakers in Pennsylvania, you had the Baptists in the East and the Northeast to an extent, you had the Puritans, you got the Catholics in Maryland, and so they said, look, we're okay with state governments requiring these things, but we just don't want the national government doing it. Most people in Massachusetts were Puritans or at the very least a Christian in some regard. So it wasn't a big deal to swear that you were a Christian there. But in terms of the national government, the idea was we don't want somebody having to swear that they're a Catholic or a Baptist or any other religious test or religious oath. Another thing that people like to bring up too is, well, what about the fact that presidents get sworn in on a Bible or members of Congress get sworn in to their jobs on a Bible? And the answer to that, the response to that's pretty simple. There is no requirement that you take an oath with your hand on the Bible. Many people have taken their oath with nothing at all. Some Muslims have been elected to Congress and got sworn in the Quran. If you wanted to, you could get sworn in on your very own book, your very own edition of Harry Potter or 50 Shades of Grey or whatever book you want, or no book at all. All right, that's up to you. Okay. Now, Article 6, the last thing in here, they also assumed the debts of states once the Constitution passed. And that means that if a state had any debts at the time of the Constitution being adopted, the national government would pay off those debts. All right. And you know what? That was something that really wrangled a lot of the larger states, because states like New York and Virginia had already paid their Revolutionary War debts back, but small states were having a tough time. But to get small states on board, it's another, they had to throw them a bone. All right. Now, last but not least, Article 7 of the Constitution. It's very simple and straightforward. Okay. It simply says that once 9 out of the 13 states approve of the Constitution, it will go into effect. And they're like, if we got 9 people, daggone it, we're going to have a new Constitution, and the other 4 states can just screw off. All right. Does that sound a little harsh? Perhaps. But luckily for us, all 13 states were on board. Okay. Now remember, the 7 articles were the original Constitution, and at first, most people, Federalists, were pretty happy, and the Anti-Federalists said, hey, we want a Bill of Rights. And the Federalists were just like, hey, you don't need a Bill of Rights. Every state constitution guarantees you certain rights, and most of them were the same. And they said, that's great, but that only guarantees that the state governments won't try to mess with our rights. We want guarantees that the national government won't mess with our rights either. And so you get the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. Okay, we're not spending time talking about the amendments. You simply just have to look at your syllabus, learn those, memorize those, and we will move on from that. So make sure you study those. Okay, that's all for today, kids. Simple video.